Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over the last two series, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the struggle for human rights. In this series, we turn our attention to the struggle to end modern slavery. I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode of the Rights Track, we are discussing the problem of slavery in supply chains. My guest is Dr. Alexander Trautrims. Alex is an assistant professor in Nottingham University Business School in its division on operations management and information systems. His research is on sourcing and procurement issues in supply chains, and he is project lead for Unchained Supply, which focuses on slavery in supply chains. So welcome, Alex, to this episode of the Rights Track.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to just start at the beginning. When we talk about supply chains, people have a sense of what a supply chain is, but if you could maybe talk about the complexity of supply chain to get us started.
So there are different understandings of what a supply chain actually is, and that will vary a lot between different business models. So some business models would be a bit more straightforward. If you think, for example, about a steel mill, that's a kind of industry that's been existing for a long time, relatively straightforward processes, clear resources that go into it, and so on. And then you got sort of the more contemporary, very complex supply chains when you think about an iPhone with lots of different components going into the phone, or modern car manufacturing. And so there's more and more actually even an understanding that a supply chain exists in an ecosystem with lots of actors around it that partake in the supply chain or just influence it from the outside.
So are there industries in which the supply chain is confined only to one country, or are we now in a situation with business that all supply chains are ultimately international?
I guess North Korea will probably have the odd domestic only supply chain, but in an advanced economy that's very hard to imagine. It would take you a lot of effort to avoid global sourcing or using products from around the world.
And the drive for global sourcing is really one about cost. So it's about driving down marginal cost, maximizing profit. And that profit motive within global capitalism is one which firms then sort of seek out areas for cheaper production. Is that what drives the supply chain?
Partially, yes.
Okay.
So it depends again on what kind of product you're looking at. So sometimes it might be that you only get that product from abroad, right? I mean, if you look at the UK, if you wanted to insist on eating only British bananas, you would be waiting for a long time. Mm-hmm. So it can be other factors, that something's only available in another country, or certain expertise, or maybe another country can just do something a little bit better than we can do it because they have a particular skill set or access to specialist resources. And that can be human resources. But where global supply chains are really heading into usually problems with labor exploitation is where the only thing that matters is the price. Yeah.
And the way to drive down that price ultimately is to go for the cheapest labor possible, and in some instances, as you're discovering in your research, free labor in the sense that labor that isn't paid for.
Yeah, absolutely. If the only thing that ever matters is the price, then if a high proportion of your production cost is labor cost, then the only way to win a contract against your competitors is by producing cheaper. So you need cheaper labor. And I mean, if you're imagining, if you are running a business and you have overcapacity and you're trying to win contracts and I might otherwise have to shut the business, people start cutting corners, or people just want to increase their profits at the expense of the workforce. So it then becomes a race to the bottom, and at some point you end up in situations that are exploitative.
Right. So that race to the bottom really does drive the problem that you're identifying in terms of slavery and supply chains. So if that's the case, and if we observe slavery within supply chains, I'm interested in the kind of, not the liability necessarily, but the obligation. So in human rights discourse, we often talk about a state obligation framework, that there are international human rights treaties, that states become parties to these treaties, and that these treaties place an obligation on the state to protect, respect, and fulfill human rights. Does any of that work for the business and human rights field, or do we need some other kind of machinery to get at the heart of the problem?
It doesn't seem to be working very well at the moment. The systematics are slightly different depending on the legislative context. So Brazil, for example, had quite an advanced labor law where as a business you were actually held responsible for the people in your supply chain, not just only for the people within your own organization. When you look at the UK, it's absolutely the opposite. There's a trend towards outsourcing, particularly low-skill labor, and the only way that external service provider can do that cheaper than you could do it in-house is often because they give their workers worse terms and conditions than the original organization had done. You see that probably a lot in the public sector, where a lot of contracts go out to organizations that are pure outsourcing companies, and where they just pay their people worse, treat them worse, and at some point you then create situations where it's getting worse and worse and worse, and it gets into exploitative practices again.
Yeah, so there's a really interesting border, or sort of frontier, if you will, between sort of unfair labor practices of the kind that were investigated in Flatcom and some of the assembly lines in producing computers, Toshiba and Apple and some of those issues. And I know the Fair Labor Association in Washington, D.C. was investigating those practices. We had a podcast with Shireen Hertel from the University of Connecticut, talked about those issues, etc. But this is actually crossing that border between unfair labor and really exploitative stuff. So tell me about some of the conditions of really exploitative labor.
So getting first into the step before is actually wherever you would look in a business for labor exploitation is where labor is just becoming a replaceable commodity. The low-skill labor, where it doesn't matter if somebody leaves, there are plenty of people that would replace that labor. So you would look very often at low-skill manual labor. And so when we speak about slavery, that's why it always hits people at the most vulnerable part of the supply chain, because they don't have any bargaining power against the organization that they're working for.
Right. So just about what tips them into fully exploitative. So there's unfair, and then you're tipping in. You said, well, there's a step first, and then there's replaceability, substitutability. But then when does it become that there's a coercive practice where the people working on a particular project are not paid, they're not free to leave their site of employment? How do we know that then is taking place?
That is difficult, and I think it's difficult also often for law enforcement bodies to actually make that clear distinction. So I think when we see cases that are clear-cut modern slavery, we see situations where people are not allowed to leave, so they have very clearly taken their freedom away from them. They have their travel documents withheld. They're being put under pressure through violence or threats against them or their family, and so those are, let's say, for you and me, a bit more obvious. Whereas I think the sort of it gets more into exploitative practices, then at some point become unethical and unlawful is very often where you have a normalisation happening of people being treated badly.
Right.
So a lot of the work we've been doing, for example, into car washes is most people in this country who drive a car will probably have that washed manually. We know from our work that most of these car washes have no business model that would allow them to pay these workers the minimum wage.
Yeah, so I can go to Tesco and get my car washed on the Tesco car park by, let's say, a gentleman. In fact, I had this done several months ago before reading some of your research, where a gentleman from Kirkuk was managing a team from Romania who washed the car. It takes half an hour, and I pay £6. So 6 people wash my car for half an hour for £6.
Yeah.
And you just do the simple math on that, and obviously the conclusion you reach is these people are not being paid a minimum wage.
Yeah. And it's clearly observable.
Right.
I mean,
but are they getting paid any wage?
That is a good question. It depends probably on the individual car wash.
Yeah.
Some of them will probably use forms where they pretend that they are self-employed.
Okay.
Others will use violence to keep them there.
And so it might be those people are coerced to do this work.
Yeah.
Right. And where does the liability sit there? So does Tesco have a responsibility to do a proper vetting of these establishments? Do they have an obligation to stop this practice? Is there any lobbying going on in the UK to really look into this issue?
Yeah, I think car washes got a lot of attention from the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, from the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and recently also more in the media, just to make people aware that. And I think a lot of citizens are worried that they support these practices, but there are no other car washes left, and they also all look kind of not great when you go there.
But is it like the free-range egg problem, where you go to people and you say, look, would you be willing to pay 20p more per dozen eggs if you knew those eggs were produced under better conditions for the chickens? Is there an analogy here that would you be willing to pay £15 for your car to be washed in a proper way that's purely regulated, and that the people washing your car are being better paid?
Yeah, I think we moved on from this initial idea that if you just give consumers more information and let them make informed decisions, that they will always behave more ethically. I think we now in a situation where we know that most consumers are willfully ignorant. I think a big difference to organic food, for example, is that for organic food you would be very often willing to pay a premium because you associate health benefits for yourself with it. Where in labor exploitation, there's no negative impact on your health if you're using exploitative practices.
It's just a negative impact on your morality, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the big question is it a legal problem or is it a moral problem?
Yeah.
So from a moral perspective, yes, Tesco has a responsibility to check what's going on in their car parks and their forecourts, if they authorize somebody to operate a car wash there who pays them rent. Do they legally have an obligation to do that? I don't necessarily think so.
But there's minimum wage legislation, so those people technically should be getting £8.45 an hour.
Yeah, but they wouldn't be on Tesco's payroll, right? So they would be on an external company's
And that's
payroll.
where that legal distance sits then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where it comes down to lobbying, commercial pressure, naming and shaming perhaps, and those are the harder things to achieve in trying to eradicate some of these practices.
Yeah, and I think there's less and less acceptance that just because it's happening somewhere in your supply chain but not in your own organization, that it therefore has nothing to do with you and it's outside your control.
So ignorance is not a defense.
No,
Yeah.
I don't think it is. I think, or I hope, that some of the sort of modern slavery legislation will develop into a situation where we will ask, could this company have reasonably known that this is going on, and do they have the right systems in place that they should have known, and if so, they are being held responsible for something that's happening in their supply chain, even if it's not within their own organization.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is one example. If I drive around Nottingham or the periphery of any major town or city, I see disused gas stations or old car dealerships have been converted into car washes. But I understand that you've done some mathematical modeling about this. So was that in an aid to understand the sort of full nature and extent of the problem, that you could sort of understand how that worked, and then you extrapolated from that using the computers and statistics? Is that what you were doing?
So we actually did it on a very small scale. So first it was more about the academic interest in proving a concept. So we focused on actually one particular car wash. Actually, my colleague Thomas went there quite a few times with his family, and everybody had a stopwatch, and they actually measured how long every individual task would take, and obviously they advertised their price list, so what money they would make for a particular service, and then you can measure how many cars would drive past that road. You can put in likelihoods that they stop. You can adjust that to the weather, so if it's a sunny day, more cars will stop to have their cars washed than on a rainy day. And you can, with openly available data, so the traffic data, for example, would come from all the people who have Android phones and drive. It was a fairly simple tool to prove very easily that that particular car wash we looked at could never ever possibly pay the minimum wage. So for us it was the academic interest, but what I understand is that some law enforcement bodies are now using that at a bigger scale to scan larger databases of car washes.
Okay, so if we go from car washes out to a big corporation again, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK 2015 has a provision that any company that makes more than 36 million turnover per annum, whether it's a British company or a company registered to do business in the UK, has an obligation, A, to come up with a statement about how it's going to fight slavery in its supply chain. And I'm curious, how does a company know? Because there's a lot of literature in the CSR literature, for example, where the CEO of a company sitting in a headquarters in Cincinnati or London or wherever, and somebody says, well, how long is your supply chain to produce one DVD for a Disney company or something? And they might think it's 30, 40 or 50 when in fact the steps in the chain might be over 1,000. So how does a company learn about its own supply chain, and how does it develop a monitoring system so that it can comply with the Modern Slavery Act? Because this is a big legal obligation. It's not just your operations in the UK, it's wherever they might be in the world. That's quite a big obligation.
Yeah, and I think actually the Modern Slavery Act is quite helpful in challenging supply chain practitioners to learn about their own supply chains. I think when you go into any bigger business, you would sometimes be shocked how little they know about where their own stuff is coming from. I think it actually encourages good supply chain practice, that you know where your things come from. The challenge is, however, though, very different between different companies. So if you're a retailer, for example, and you're buying from 20,000 suppliers, different things from around the world, that is a huge challenge to find out where all this is coming from. That's very different if you're a more specialist importer of particular materials and you only have 3 or 4 suppliers abroad that you really need to monitor quite closely. So the challenge is different for different business practitioners.
Yeah, and so, extractive industries have their own challenges in terms of local production. Steel, as you say, is a quite straightforward example of production and can be monitored quite closely. But I guess finished electronic goods, textiles, shoes, clothing, those sorts of things are quite open to abuse then.
They are, because it's a very complex product, electronics. So you get all these components, and those components come from suppliers who have sub-suppliers, and they make little components and little parts. So I think also that it comes in that to guarantee that a supply chain is perfectly slavery-free is actually almost impossible, certainly for the more complex supply chains, because there's always a residual risk that somebody commits the crime of slavery. The challenge is very different, and I think that's why we find in industry very often that businesses come together with actually their competitors, because they will have similar supply chains and they face similar challenges, and together they have enough buying power towards their suppliers to really tell them to change things. The more fragmented an industry is, the more steps you have in the supply chain, the more distance and more anonymization between the very original producer and the very end consumer. The bigger that distance, the bigger the anonymization, the easier it is to bring modern slavery into it somewhere.
Yeah, it's just completely hidden from view in that sense.
Yeah.
So you're heading a project called Unchained Supply. What are the main aims and objectives of that project?
Well, the main aims are to find solutions that enable particularly supply chain and procurement professionals to actually detect modern slavery in their supply chain, to risk assess their supply chain better, actually find out how, if they want to improve labor practices in their supply chain, how do they best diffuse those good practices in their supply chain. So just because I convinced my tier 1 supplier, that doesn't mean they then convince their suppliers, which would be a tier 2 supplier, and so on. So is it trying to find those trigger points, who in the supply chain you actually need to turn around to really achieve a long-lasting effect. And then what I find very important for our research is that area of supply chain design. So when you look at a supply chain map, could you instantly spot that this is a high-risk supply chain or a low-risk supply chain? And the next step would then be going from being descriptive of understanding the risk in an existing supply chain to actually becoming prescriptive and saying, okay, if you're setting up a new supply chain, these are supply chain features that you can design into this that would reduce the risk of modern slavery to be occurring in there.
That's interesting. And I guess there's also the problem then, if one company, let's say, eliminates slavery from its supply chain, or at least has this prescriptive approach that it tries to reduce the risk of engaging in those practices, there's still a high probability that another firm will just fill that space, right? So it's a really tough challenge.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And particularly in the global supply chain, you're sourcing things from another country or developing country, and you're trying to improve their ethical standards and their labor practices, and they might just say, this is too much effort for me, I just sell it to the Chinese instead. And so it is in supply chain management very often falsely assumed that the buyer is always in the stronger position than the supplier.
Right.
So there are plenty of situations, even if they're just temporary, where the supplier would be in a much more powerful situation. So if you think, for example, bricklayers in the UK at the moment, there's just not enough of them.
Yep.
And so if you are putting too many difficult questions onto your bricklayer suppliers, then they might just decide to build somebody else's house first, and your project will then run behind, and your customers will get angry. So they can be quite difficult actually from a buyer's perspective. You have a bit of a dilemma there.
Yeah, there was a piece on Radio 4 about the housing crisis, and one of the factors that was raised was not enough bricks and not enough bricklayers.
Yeah.
So it's a very simple proposition. So if there's excess demand for something, the supplier can just run off to another customer. It's fascinating stuff, and obviously in need of more research. And I guess just in closing, that there must be business interest in the work that you're doing, because businesses have this obligation under the Act to comply. They want to know more. So have you had interest from business in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Hugely, I think, particularly from supply chain procurement professionals, particularly from organizations that have someone with a job title like Sustainable Procurement Director, companies that have human rights programs, from a variety of industries, really. You also find in any industry that for some companies it's just a legalistic approach. Actually met companies, supply chain directors who said, I have no idea who wrote our modern slavery statement, but it wasn't me.
Right.
So, someone in the law firm wrote this with probably absolute minimal understanding of their supply chain's risk to be exposed to modern slavery. So I think that is the big step for companies to make from a legal problem and legal compliance to actually doing something that is really meaningful in their supply chain. And supply chain professionals have a lot of other things on their hands. They need to keep a business running. Mm-hmm. They also got a lot of more compliance issues going on at any given time. And they also not necessarily geared up for detecting modern slavery or designing it out of their supply chain. And so I think this is where we really want to be helpful with our work, to develop some tools that actually help these practitioners. Because so far I've only met supply chain practitioners who don't want their supply chains to do evil stuff.
Right.
They don't want that, but they don't know how to run them in a way that they can avoid it. They very often find that they are sort of falsely accused in the media of being ignorant or evil, where they just need help.
Yeah.
And I think that's what our job is. Yeah.
That's great. And as ever, in many issues around human rights, the law is not enough. It's always about law, behavior, power, regulatory framework, political will, all those sorts of major factors that all come together to stop particularly abhorrent practices. So it looks like the work you're doing is contributing to solutions to this problem, and it's just been a real pleasure having you on this episode of The Rights Track. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Christine Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 3 of The Rights Track is funded by the Rights Lab, a University of Nottingham programme of research which is helping to end modern slavery. You can find out more in our episode show notes, and please subscribe to the podcast for future episodes as we find out more about the work being done to achieve that aim.